First, let's get character saves and imports out of the way. If you want to import from a character account, put your account name here, hit start, and it will retrieve all of your characters. These are all of mine. And you can say, you know, I only want heist or whatever league. And you can import the passive tree, jewels, and item skills and hit done, and it all gets imported into a build. On the other hand, if you want to generate a code for a build that you've made so you can share it with other people, go ahead and hit generate here. This will give you the full code, which you can shorten down by hitting share with pastebin. This is the POB code that you'll see referenced by essentially everybody. Then once you have this pastebin code, as you can see here, you could hit copy, or you could copy it from some other source and say, I want to import from pastebin, put that in there, click import, it says code is valid, and you can choose to import over whatever build you're working on, or import it into a new build, which is usually safer, doesn't risk overwriting anything. The tree tab allows us to explore the passive tree and path of exile for whatever build we're working on. In order to be able to select the ascendancy that you want, you need to tell it which class you are, and then which ascendancy you're using. Otherwise, you will not be able to click on any of these ascendancy nodes. And we can zoom in here, get a better idea, and pick whatever it is that we want. It's important when working on your build to put in the actual character level that you plan to be, because the base character level also adds base stats, as in total life, total mana, and evasion rating. In the upper left, we can pick which bandit rewards that we've chosen for this build, as well as our pantheons, and as you scroll through you can see they have all of the descriptions on what bonuses you're getting. As you start adding passives to the tree, you'll see up here at the top how many you've used versus how many you have total available to you at level 100. Down here at the bottom, you have the option to reset your passive tree if you like. You can also import and export trees. Usually this is done simply through importing or exporting through a path of building link, also known as a pastebin or a POB. As you might expect, you can also search for any nodes that you're looking for. Oh, there's Supreme Ego. Easy. In the skills tab, we can put in whichever gem we want by going to this list and start typing something in. It'll give you a list. We'll go ahead and X that out. We can also put in the level of the gem, the quality, any variant that it might have, and whether it's enabled or disabled. In this tab, we can also select which item the gems are socketed into right here. You can use these socket groups to differentiate different types of gems that you have. For instance, if you click New and go to Label and say Utility Gems, and we could disable it, and we could put that below here, and then we could say all of these are utilities. Just helps to break things out a little bit so you can see it a little easier. The notes section is just as you would think. It's just extra notes to explain certain concepts of the build, if the build creator wants to, or if you want to do that for your own builds. Little things that aren't necessarily obvious, but are worth mentioning can be put here. In the items section, we're going to select the gear that our character is going to use. Here, we have a list of all uniques in the game. You can start typing in. Anything with VAA in it is going to show up here. Type in chevrons, for instance. It'll limit it. If you like, you can of course sort by these drop downs here, but it's typically fastest to just type in the name of the unique. Down here we have a list of rare items. These are all the tier 1 bases of all available items, as well as any jewelry bases. Over here we have our shared items. You can drag and drop if you like here. This list is shared across all builds, so this here is always available to you. If there are certain baseline stats you want to make sure all of your builds have, you could throw in a pair of boots, gloves, etc., whatever you want, and easily drag and drop from there into our builds items here. This list here of all items is specific to the build that we're working on, and this list is where these drop downs pull from. So for example, let's throw in a bunch of items here real quick. There we go. As you can see here, now that we have this list, we can go to the Admiral, we can put in this, put in some weapons, put in some two-hand weapons, whatever we want, amulet, you get the idea. Of course, items have different tiers and value ranges, so if we go ahead and double click on this amulet, the shared item window will be replaced by our modifier list. We have a lot of options here. We can anoint. Here we can search by name. We can corrupt and select one implicit and or a second implicit. We can add our influences to the item, one or two. And we can say which catalyst there is. If we select one here, we'll get this scroll bar that allows us to put to 0 to 20% quality. And then of course we have our prefixes and our suffixes. These lists are modified by which influences we have available to us. So you will see we have some of our influence modifiers in our prefixes and in our suffixes. And then for everything else, we have this add modifier button here. This allows us to put a crafting bench mod on, or we can put an essence mod or a custom modifier. Let's not worry about that for right now. Once you have all your modifiers selected, you can grab this diamond and move it to whichever tier bracket. As you can see, these lines are breaking out the tier, and you can see here on the pop-up which tier it is and what the range is. So once you have that finalized, you can go ahead and hit save, and that finalizes the item into the build, which we can then either drag and drop here, or we can click this drop down here to put it in. And if you're looking for flasks, you have to go to craft item and go to magic and go to flask. We have hybrid, life, mana, utility. So if you pick utility, you get all the lists of utility flasks, and the same for life and mana. You can go ahead and pick whichever one you want there, hit create, and then you will be given access to supply the prefix and the suffix. You can select whichever one you want there and click add to build. Once you have all your items equipped, you can make an item set by going up here to manage and then clicking on new, creating a name, and then you will have item sets available to you if you wanted to have a default equipment setup that you would put across multiple characters. Maybe you're trying to build different variations of the same build, and you might want to do this to save you some time. Two more notes for this section. You do have access to weapon swaps right here. You can pick one or two, and you also have access to creating custom items. We'll go over that later. One thing you can do when you find items that you're looking to swap out in your build to see how they might affect you, real world items that you're looking to trade for, you can go to the official trade site and say you want this Gemini claw, and you don't want to put in all these modifiers on item. You can go ahead and click item or copy item there and go back to path of building in the item section and hit Control V. Now here you can say add to build. If you want to modify any of this, you'll need to go into edit and modify the item directly here. It doesn't have any of the normal bars available to prefixes and suffixes, but it is a quick way to just import an item real quick that you want to test out on your build. Back on the tree, our last section here, we'll talk about this little snapshot pane. This is an overview, high level of all of the key things that you want to know about your character. As you can see, you can go through the list. You have your damage, you have your stats, you have your life, and basic defenses about regeneration, block chance, and down here the resistances. The number in the parentheses, of course, is how much you are overcapped for that resistance. For anyone simply looking to take a build guide from a favorite streamer or from a friend and import it into a convenient one-size-fit-all place where you can look at how the build works, what requirements it has for items, and the basic snapshot of its damage and defenses, this is all you need. For anyone looking to dig a little bit further in the calculations and configuration of damage setups, stick around. The configuration tab has a few uses, but its primary purpose is to answer conditional questions about your character's effective DPS. I'm going to go through left to right and point out specific modifiers that allow us to manipulate and calculate our true DPS. In the general section, are you always on full life is absolutely a modifier we might want to be paying attention to, especially for melee builds that use the melee damage on full life support. We might also be interested in the enemy corpse life if we're using a skill that is reliant on corpse hit points. And if we're using ailments like poison, for instance, and we want to know whether we have our average damage up or crits only, we can calculate those two modes. The when in combat section is a big one. This is where we tell the application whether we have charges going on, whether we have conditional, often temporary buffs, but let's go through. So as you can see at the top, we have our power, frenzy, and endurance charges. If we had ascendancy specific charges like blitz charges from the berserker, those would show up here too. Going down the list, most of these should be familiar to you. If you mouse over them, it'll tell you what the buff is that you're looking at, and it tells you that any modifiers or buffs that are reliant on having, say, Fortify active will then become active if you click this. Up here we have our skill related options, so we have our brands, we have our sigil of power. For example, if we were to enable Flame Wall, that is where this would show up as well. Projectiles travel through Flame Wall. We could say yes. As you can see there, it gives us 63 Ignite DPS, 63.9, and just a tiny bit more DPS there. But this is where you would tell it how many active brands you have, how many stages of Sigil of Power is. You can see the DPS go up or down based on that. Now the map modifiers and player debuffs section. This section is primarily used to answer very specific questions or scenarios that you have about your build. The most useful one that you could maybe play around with here that might save you a little bit of time, if your tree doesn't have elemental equilibrium on it, then you could instead go here and say, I have LE equilibrium. And then you have these set of options over here to determine what your damage looks like based on what element the enemy was hit by. Mostly this section, in my experience, is not super useful for determining general DPS questions. But if you're interested in what this section has to offer, you can certainly play around with it. Everything is fairly straightforward, and whatever you mouse over will have an explanation. Last but not least, we have the for effective DPS section. Top of the list is your crit chance lucky. This is already active if you have a flask that is a diamond flask active in your items section. But other than that, you have a list of modifiers that are likely to be critical to the program calculating your true DPS. And just a couple extra notes on this section because I think this is fairly self-explanatory. For the enemy as a boss dropdown, most of the time you want this to be set to Cirrus if you're looking for calculating effective DPS in situations where it really matters. What that means is if you set this to no, then you're effectively saying, I want to know how much damage I'm dealing to a white mob or a yellow rare mob in a map. Most of the time, these mobs are getting obliterated by any decent build. So the real question is, how much DPS am I doing against Cirrus, who has, as you can see, these modifiers that are reducing damage against him. So if you have millions of DPS against Cirrus, you know that your build or the skill that you're looking at is doing pretty good DPS. And the second thing I wanted to mention is this bottom section here. If you want to play around, not go through the work of setting up any extra curses or whatnot, and you say, I wonder, how effective is this if the enemy resistances, I can push them to -90, for example. Then this is kind of a quick shortcut to bypass extra effort to put that into your build and instead say, just tell me what the actual output is. The configuration tab is also really good for cross-checking builds that you might find online that are claiming massive amounts of DPS or a massive amount of hit points or what have you. You can go in here and you can see what conditional statements they have applied to make this total DPS number what it is. So, if you go through and all of these are checked off and they have 50% effective shock and things like this, maybe the enemy boss is set to no, you can kind of piece this together and say, in a real world situation, do they really have all of these buffs on? Probably not. Are they getting 50% effect of their shock? Unlikely. We can use the calculations page, the Calcs page here, which we'll talk about in a second, to go into further detail. But this page right here allows you to kind of see where the build creator's mind is and what conditional statements they're making about their build. The calculations page. Let's start at the top and try to break down this mass of numbers into something a little more readable. So right at the top, we're telling the application which skill we're looking at. In this case, we're looking at ball lightning. Almost all of the time, you're going to want to set this to effective DPS because it takes into account not only all of your buffs, but also the monster buffs, the resistances, any negative aspects that might be tamping down your damage output that maybe you selected in configuration, for example, for map modifiers, player debuffs, etc. It takes all of this into account and tries to estimate your true DPS, which is what this number is here. Now, if we go down to skill hit damage, we can mouse over most of these numbers and it will give you this side list telling you where it's getting all of these numbers from. It's saying a total of 558% increased damage as opposed to more damage. And you can mouse over and you can say, oh, look, this is where all of that's coming from. 159 from Pledge of Hands, all those from Jewels, etc., etc. I know where these numbers are coming from. Total more, same thing. We can see the -10 from Spell Echo there. It takes all of your items and skills, your tree, and puts it all together to find these numbers. And then if we come over and mouse over our increase specific to lightning damage, we can see where all of that is. And same thing with more. And then it will take the effective DPS. This is where it kind of calculates your elemental penetration values, what the monster's effective resistances are, and it gives us our total skill hit damage. As you can see here, because I have at Ziri's Flask on, the portion of total damage is 91%. If we mouse over here to our chaos, then we can see what levels of chaos damage we're doing while the flask is active. Because this is a Pathfinder build, the flasks are always active, so I'm going to assume that it is. And that brings us back here to our skill average hit damage, totaling all of that up, all of your other calculations in the configuration tab, your tree, your skill, your items, all of it gets brought into this skill average hit number right here. And then the skill DPS, which is your total DPS number here, gets modified by your cast rate or your attack rate if it's a melee skill. And it also tells you how much mana cost the skill is. Now, I don't think there's anything extra to be gained for me going through each and every one of these one by one. I think it's more important for this section to explain what this section of the application is doing and what it's trying to tell you. You can go through and really zero in on where these numbers are coming from, look at the calculations it's making in order to give you a more informed perspective of where your damage is coming from, where your damage mitigation is coming from, where your life is coming from. All of these things help you form a complete picture of the character that you're either building or the one that you plan to use. Path of Building also saves your builds. If you go back here, you'll be brought to your build list. You can sort these by class, by last time you edited them, however you'd like to. You can also copy them, hit Control-C, Control-V, and you can paste a new build if you want to, make a copy of a build that you want to tweak slightly, but you want to hang on to the original so you can look at them side by side, for instance. That's a possibility. Now, I said we'd come back to the edit items, and here we are. So Path of Building allows you to go up here and click this edit button. This will give you the item via text format, and you can, if you'd like, go ahead and add custom modifiers here, should you choose. So for example, we could say custom plus 500 increased maximum life, and we'll hit save. And that was wrong, so let's go ahead and look at 2 maximum life. Okay, so we got here, plus 500 to maximum life, and we'll save. As you saw there, the text was in red. That means it's not being taken into account because something's wrong with the modifier in some way, shape, or form. And so instead, we do this, and we hit save. As you can see, my life total there is 4,013. We hit save, and boom, it goes into effect. Now, the best use of this functionality that I've seen is when the ascendancies were in a state of flux and constantly being changed fairly massively. People would create items that mimicked the ascendancies so that you could pick and choose which new ascendancy tabs or skills you were going to get in order to see how that would play out in your theory crafting in Path of Building. If there are other useful means of creating custom items in this way that you otherwise can't within Path of Building, I would like to hear them. Now that we've gone over the basics and we have an idea of what happens within Path of Building, Let's take a look at how we would use it in the real world. So this build we have here is an Impale Champion. A friend of mine messaged me this morning. He's building this build and he asked me for advice on where to go in terms of what items to buy and how to optimize, because his damage was nowhere near this. He was sitting at about 1.6 million impale damage, whereas you can see here we have about 7.8. Pretty massive difference. He's level 83 versus this one that is 98. So the first thing I looked at was the tree. He actually had most of the damage nodes except for these 4 up here, the disemboweling cluster. So right away, if we uncheck this passive node, that will undo all 4 of those. And as you can see down below, we say unallocating this node and all nodes depending on it will give you minus 19.8% damage. So that's pretty significant. So right off the bat, go level up 4 more times and get this. The next thing I did was I went to the configuration page to compare his versus this final build setup, and I noticed that he didn't have taunted checked on. Now, this is a bit of game knowledge, but I know that as a champion, you have access to Conqueror, which is a 100% chance to taunt on hit, and Worthy Foe, which makes it so enemies can't evade your attacks. This is significant. So I went here and I said, well, you don't have taunted turned on. If we take off taunting on this final build, look at the impale damage, 4.7 million up to 7.8. That is a humongous damage difference. Make sure your ascendancy skills and whatever else line up with what's on the configuration page. Remember, your conditional page. So next, naturally, we go over to items to take a look at that comparison. Now, just trust me when I say he had most of everything here. He at least had the main gear. He did not have a Watcher's Eye, and he also did not have a Face Breaker that had Curse with vulnerability on hit with almost 50% increased effect. Now, it won't show it necessarily right here because it's doing an extra step of calculations after, but if you replace the Face Breaker with one that is normal, you can see, watch the Impale DPS goes down 600,000, right? So there's a big chunk of DPS right there. And if we mouse over Watcher's Eye and say none, and we go back here and just mouse over it, you can see there towards the bottom, 36% Impale DPS. The Watcher's Eye is a humongous piece of damage for this build. So if we mouse over our items and compare it to the items that we have in our build, then we can see where the greatest percent differences are. Last but not least, you want to go over to the skills tab and make sure that the gem links that they have set up match the ones that you have. If there's a mismatch, take a look, add in the skill gems as a hypothetical in your own build, and see how that affects your damage. You know, I do my best to keep these videos to 15 minutes or less, but Path of Building is a really important tool to use, and it has immense potential for teaching people how to use the game and how to get their characters up to where they want it to be. So I felt like it was worth the extra time to dig into an example and make sure the basics and fundamentals and how to use them in an actual use case was important to include. If you made it to the end of the video, thank you so much for watching. Hit like and subscribe. It helps me a lot as a smaller content creator to know that I'm on the right path and making stuff that's actually useful to the community. Until we meet again, stay sane, Exile.